Thank you everyone for coming back. Hopefully you've had a good lunch, and welcome to the first of the parallel sessions for the ADM+S News and Media Symposium. Welcome to this session called It's Not Just the Algorithm, How We Search. My name's Professor Dan Angus. I'm a Chief Investigator in ADM+S at the QT node and also the Chair of the Infrastructure Committee for the ADM+S Centre. It's my great pleasure to have you here and to welcome also our panel. I will start again by acknowledging that we are on Gadigal land, and of course this panel pays our respects to the elders, and also thank you for the lovely welcome we received this morning. So with me on the panel today, we have a bit of a changed panel. Unfortunately, Ariadna Matamoros-Fernandez, who's a great colleague and works also with me closely at the QT node, has fallen ill and so has been unable to join us on the panel. Ari works extensively in the Search Experience project, and so we are still going to update you on some of the results that Ari has been spearheading and give due acknowledgement to her contributions to the project, but unfortunately Ari is not able to be with us today. In her stead, at 24 hours notice, Arjun Srinivas has joined us. Arjun is a PhD student in the centre who's supervised by Associate Professor Tim Graham, who's also a centre member, and of course Professors Jean Burgess and Axel Bruns, who are also CIs on the centre. So Arjun has kindly stepped up to the plate, and we thank him for doing it at a moment's notice. Unfortunately, that does mean that we are a manel now, and I do apologise for that, that it's not something we would have intended going into this, and of course it's something that we should always be conscious of. So sincere apologies from all of us for subjecting you to a manel, but I'm sure as manels go, we will do our best to kind of work through that. But yeah, in continuing the introduction, so Arjun, as I said, is a PhD student. Arjun's title of his PhD project is YouTube's News Conundrum, an examination of authoritative sources in YouTube's recommendations. So an incredibly awesome addition to our panel at last minute. We also have Dr. James Meese, who you heard of this morning, of course, who's one of our co-conveners of the News and Media Focus Area for the Centre and who works at RMIT University. And at the end there is Dr. Abdul Obeid, who, if you're in the last session on the Ad Observatory, is our fearless data engineer in the centre and is kept busy, yes. Abdul has many fans in the centre because he provides the critical kind of blood flow of data and infrastructure keeping on flowing through our amazing centre. And so aside from the Ad Observatory, another project that's definitely kept Abdul busy is what you're going to hear about in this session, which is a search experience. Before I start my intro and positioning of the panel and what we're going to talk about over the next hour, I would also like to acknowledge the tremendous work of my good colleague, Professor Axel Bruns, who started this project at the start of the centre, and who, through his laureate success and getting his laureate working at the moment, has started kind of pass the reins over to some of the members that are with us on the panel today. So a massive acknowledgement to Axel's work in really kind of giving the big thinking and genesis of this project. And of course, one of our partners, Algorithm Watch, who had laid the groundwork for much of what we'll talk to today, the kind of data spend initiative that they have spearheaded, that we've extended, and certainly Abdul's kind of taken code from and updated, are a great collaborator and friend to have in the centre. So let me start us off with a bit of an overview of how this project comes about and what we're interested in doing here. So search engines, as we all know, are a crucial tool for everyday information discovery. We rely on search engines for so much, for finding information on topics like news and media and current affairs, through everyday whimsical, personal, and other topics of current interest. In August, our centre is actually going to be marking the 30th anniversary of the very first web search engine. And indeed, incidentally, also 25 years since Google was established as a search provider. And so, yeah, 30 years we've had of search as a concept. And I think, just a small plug for that if you're interested in anything we talk about today, there will be much more of a feast around search and its implications in that event in August. So certainly keep an ear to the ground for that. Registrations are open and it's going to be a fantastic day there in mid-August. But back to search though. So conceptually, I want us to stretch our imaginations a little bit at this point to think beyond, Google and others like small boxes in big seas of white HTML, and think about search in a much more generalist, conceptual, way. That how omnipotent search has become in the way that we go about trying to find information, that search bars and search itself is integrated into so much of our experience of news and media, that we are forever searching on these services. And so, as a form of information discovery, you can appreciate how pervasive and how interesting and why we want to study these things, because they govern so much of our life and our experience of news and media. And I guess, therefore, it's critical for us to understand, if they're so pervasive, that the information recommended by these tools is accurate, relevant, and reliable, right? We want to make sure that when we are using these things as part of our everyday life, that we are using them in a way that they're providing us with a responsible and kind of ethically and accurate-minded service. And so it's also important, I think, then for us, given their pervasiveness, to have a good public and open understanding of how those systems work. So many search engines attempt to, I guess, anticipate the information needs of their users. And so in the last, 30 years since we've had the very, very first origins of search emerge, we've seen this kind of emergence of more and more forms of personalisation, where in a way, when I give this lecture to, my first year media and comms students, I talk about us, leaving the information age and coming into the age of recommendation, where instead of us maybe going searching for information is finding its way to us, right? And so it's actually kind of reversing that flow a little bit. But certainly with that, in that contemporary landscape, we need to understand better how those systems of personalisation work. So it's on this last point that the personalisation or tuning of search that we've seen a raft of concerns in the kind of popular imaginary and in academic literature in all forms, and the most persistent, of course, being Eli Pariz's idea of filter bubbles. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and pretend to be Axel and give you all the kind of filter bubbles of, BS and all of that. You can go and read his book if you want that. But certainly, since this kind of idea has been birthed, it's been a very, very prevalent myth, some might say, or idea, slightly less conceptualized or really empirically, robustly investigated, idea that's been out there. We saw it emerge in things like The Social Dilemma and other kinds of popular conceptualizations. And it's really at this where I think ADMS has played a really foundational role in the last couple of years through this particular project, in really trying to come to terms with how do these systems really work, right? So while this myth has maybe been out there and conceptually is quite vague, concerns are still there around how people understand their relationship with search engines. How is my search different from your search and everyone else's search within our communities? And so we can't quiet those concerns, but what we can do is we can give them some empirical rigor. We can really robustly try and test this and see to what extent is personalization a factor within various search products, and should we be worried? So that's really the starting point for this project, the Australian Search Experience, is to try and attempt to, in some small way, furnish us with some data, some real evidence of the degree of personalisation that is happening through a range of popular search products. So at ADMS, we embarked on addressing this gap, as I said, by building the Australian Search Experience. It's a social observatory, very similar to what you heard in the last panel around the Ad Observatory, which is a new kind of data donation experiment attempting to address these particular concerns. It operates at a whole of population level to assess the impact of personalisation on search results encountered by individual users of those products, systematically comparing these results across our large and diverse group of participants. and investigating the changes in search results over time, of course, as well. I should say this, that search is not a static thing. Of course, search engines operate in a constantly changing dynamic information environment, and particularly when we start looking at search around concepts like news and searching within news products, of course, we expect that there is going to be significant change over time when it comes to how news products are ranked on any given moment of any given day. And so within search even, there is a huge diversity of what we would expect around the degree of change when it comes to rankings of search products. So at this point, I'm going to turn over to Abdul at the end to just run us through a bit of a technical description of what the search experience looks like under the hood, what we've done to build this, and kind of bring us up to speed so we're all on the same page in terms of functionally how this has all worked. So thank you, Abdul.
Thanks for that introduction, Dan. So as Dan has prefaced us, the objective here has really been to understand search results within contemporary search engines. And when we think about how we want to structure a research project of this kind, the results are digital, and so the solution, the data acquisition mechanism, needs to be digital as well. What we did was we took code from Algorithm Watch. They did some great original work to facilitate this idea of understanding search results and acquiring search results from participating research participants. We took this code and we developed it further to produce a plugin software that you could download on your browser. We repurposed it for Google Chrome, Mozilla Firefox, and Microsoft Edge. And essentially, if you were someone who wanted to participate in this project, we would refer to you in this context as the citizen scientist, because you are part of this project. We are relying upon understanding your persona, your interaction with the search engine to get a better idea of how search results are being served to you. So you download this plugin, and then when you download this plugin, it sits in your browser, and you're then fronted with a registration page. You go through the agreement process. You submit some basic demographic details to just identify, how old you might be, your gender, your income bracket, demographic characteristics that can help us study and interpret demographic trends that might be important for understanding the search results that you're then faced with. So then what happens is that this software, it is now in your browser, and in the background every so many times a day, what it will do is it'll open up and it will on its own search for a variety of predetermined keywords that we were looking to investigate, ranging across a whole variety of topics. Now, it would search 4 platforms that we were very interested in. The platforms were Google Search, Google News, YouTube, and Google Videos. And each of these search engines were interesting to us because each of them delivered data in a different way. Each of them had different ways in which data was updated. The rate at which the data was updated was different, and they sort of spoke to different ways in which data can be positioned and materialized in front of you as someone engaging in the search experience. So then that data, once you submit this data autonomously from this process running in the background of your web browsing experience, this data is then sent up to a central database which informs our observatory of search experience data, and then that we can analyze to get a better idea of the search results that are being served to you and your own personal citizen scientist persona. So just moving on to the next slide. The keywords that we were interested in spanned across a whole range of topics, and this was relevant from perspectives relating to politics. We were interested also in contemporary trends, global issues, Australian issues, things like critical race theory, things like feminism. We have some terms in there that are a bit more general, like knee pain, what to do. But also right now, COVID has been a very important topic that you'll see we have a whole bunch of search topics that also speak to that. So you can see there's a variety of different things that we were looking to explore, and that we wanted to understand you as an individual, what is shown to you, and then how does that then inform your takebacks from using these search engines. So we have the data, and it's one thing to have the data, but to actually understand the data that you've got is a completely separate thing entirely. So you as a human being, you see these search results from within your search engine, and you know, usually this data it's given to you in a stacked set of list items. You know, you might have the first search result that you're most probably going to click, but then you have a full list of all these different search items that appear to you. And it doesn't matter if you're on YouTube or, you know, you're on Google Search or you're on Google News or whatever. This is primarily tabulated content is the way that we most prominently see data at the moment. And this is really important because the way in which the data is arranged, the way in which the data is positioned in front of you, the frequency at which the data is positioned in front of you, all of this stuff greatly contributes to then how relevant you interpret that data is, and also how relevant the actual search engine itself anticipates that you think that data is. So you as an individual, you donate data, and what we wanted to do was we wanted to make sense of not just your data, but everyone's data who participated in this project. Anyone who donated data to this project, we wanted to get a clear idea of what the actual general trends were that we could see from within these search engines. So it's really beneficial to be able to have a large sample of individuals donating these search results, and from this large amount of search results that we'd get, you'd get these list items that appear, and from these list items, we can then start to understand if you've got a particular search result or a particular publisher, a particular website or domain that is frequently appearing within search results, we can start to make we can start to deliver statistical insights into how these publishers, how they present themselves from within the search engine. So if I've got one citizen scientist, one research participant donating data, I can only make a deterministic interpretation of, you know, what that person is seeing in their one result. But if I've got a whole bunch of search results, I can then, for instance, let's just say I was thinking about, you know, The Guardian. I want to understand how often The Guardian appears. Well, that's a frequency of observation. The Guardian might appear, you know, X number of times. And that's informative because the number of times that it appears within the search results is indicative of how relevant the search engine perceives that publisher to be. But that's only one element. You might also have the average ranking of that publisher. That publisher might appear at the very, very top of the results, or it might appear at the bottom of the results. And this is also indicative as well. So we grabbed a few different statistics, and more so just the average and the frequencies of the publishers that are produced within these search results. That was in and of itself incredibly informative to helping us understand how these publishers are presented to us from within the search experience. So from that data, we're then able to produce analyses and fortunately very visual understandings of this data. The averages and the frequencies of observations alone informed a variety of different analyses that we only begin to allude to here. We've got a few pretty little graph that we'll be talking about further down the track. But essentially, we were able to produce bar charts, we were able to produce line graphs, tree maps, rank flows. These fit into a variety of different statistical methods that we've looked into and analyses that we've looked into to help us sort of unpack and answer the questions related to the fundamental objectives of this research project.
Thank you, Abdul. I think it's clear to say, like, one of the challenges we've kind of really had to confront within the project is, as Abdul's tried to allude to here, the kind of multi-dimensional nature of the data. You're dealing with lots of different intersecting dimensions in terms of that temporality. You're trying to essentially measure something that's not static, right? This is a constantly changing, highly dynamic news and other information environment. And so it's kind of really challenged us in how we even come to terms with that. We have to develop our own metrics, our own kinds of new forms of visualization. And so, you know, a big hat tip to Ari at this point too, because Ari's been really influential in things like the rank flow and ways of understanding how we even interpret the massive amounts of data we've collected to date. I will say the numbers. I mean, 350 million search results have been collected by our, slightly over 1,000 participants. So thank you, Abdul, for the explanation of how it's worked. I want to now go back to the research questions, and I want to come to James and Arjun around why, again, we're interested in this. So James, maybe you could offer us some opening thoughts around why you've become interested in the project.
Yeah, happy to, Dan, and terrified I'm going to turn this mic off, but I'll see how I go after the last session. So I was very interested in Google News results. We know that people are going to third-party sources like social media platforms and Google News for content. And we also know that a diverse media environment is good for democracy. People might stick to one. They might always read The Guardian or always read Sky News, or watch Sky News. But we want to know that the option is there. And intermediaries kind of change how we've traditionally thought about news diversity. So in the 80s and 90s, we used to think about who owned the news, who had control over TV stations or radio stations. And now what we're really asking is, what sort of news are people actually seeing and receiving? And that's something we call exposure diversity. Now, we don't really have a good way to get a lot of that data, particularly from intermediaries understanding what news content is presented to a user through something like Google News is not always clear. So that was until the Australian search experience. And it's an opportunity to actually sift through Google News and ask them really just basic questions, for a basic search term, how much of this news is local to Australia? How much of it is international? Is there US domains there? Are there UK domains there? Are there other domains that Google presents to an Australian user? Obviously, personalisation is a factor I'll talk about later. But yeah, and obviously understanding that kind of quasi-editorial role that Google plays when we're looking at some very simple search terms. What are the domains that come up? What are the key news sites across Australia that are most popular in the Google News corpus? So I'll leave it there and pass to Arjun.
So my primary motivation to be part of this project was essentially to understand what these platforms prioritize as news. And this was obviously informed by my time as a journalist, where I felt quite disillusioned by the sort of news that gained traction. And I thought this was an incredible opportunity to understand the motivations and the logics of these platforms and why they prioritize certain kinds of news, certain publishers over the others. And as Dan mentioned earlier, my project is titled YouTube's News Conundrum. So what is news on YouTube? And one of the ways I can potentially answer this question is to look at the prompts from the Australian search experience that have a news significance to them and see the top results that appear. And through the course of my project, I learned that there is a curatorial process at play where YouTube says that it prioritizes search results from sources that it designates as authoritative when people look for news. But this designation of authoritativeness itself seems to be problematic, as some of the work by Ari and other QUT colleagues have already demonstrated. So that is the premise that I started with for my project. If you'd like to know a little bit more, I have a poster as well in the little classroom. So, but I'll just leave it at that at the moment.
Nice plug. No, you hang on. That's fine. No, I respect the hustle. So we are going to now transition to results because you've heard the motivations, you've heard how this worked. I know you're all eager to hear what did we find, right? How is this all working? So we'll talk about results. While we're going through this section, I will again prompt you to jump on the Slido because straight after results we will go to questions, and we're going to leave plenty of time for questions, which I know many of you will have. We'll slide into results now. So Arjun, straight back to you. We've got some results here from the more kind of key terms, right? So these results speak to, as you were saying, we've got this laundry list of terms, and within that we can look kind of laser focused, right, on specific terms. So do you want to talk us through some of this and what we found?
Sure. I'd just like to qualify that this isn't part of my core PhD work, but this is a project that I'm on, that I'm working with Ari, and she is obviously more well-versed with the topics that we're looking for here, and I'm just filling in for her. And the irony isn't lost on us that one of those terms happened to be feminism, and that's the results that you'll see up next. So one of the motivations for this particular piece of research is to understand what James described earlier, the exposure diversity. What is the diversity of sources that appear when people look for information on a particular theme? Here, Ari is trying to illustrate the differences within the Google platforms themselves. You'll see that there seems to be a bit of a pattern here. With Google videos, it seems to be more like explainers. With Google search, you see a lot of like what is feminism, almost encyclopedia definitions of feminism. With Google News, it's obviously more newsy, more topical, what's happening at the moment. And for YouTube, it's just trash. It's just essentially anti-feminist content. And the sense that I get from this is obviously what appears on these platforms is driven a lot by the internal functionings and the logics on which these platforms operate. Most of these Google platforms seem to be gateway platforms where obviously content, the traffic is routed through to the eventual destination. But YouTube is an outlier. Obviously, when you're on YouTube, they want to engage you there, and that perhaps conditions the sort of content that you see there. So I think here we're just trying to illustrate how the findings can be visualized. And here it's a representation of the frequency of observations from Google videos, frequency and the average ranking that Abdul spoke about earlier. I'm not sure if the labels are evident, but
yeah, it's a long tail. I mean, I'm happy to jump in here. Yeah, that like most of the distributions you find, particularly in some of these platforms, is you do find a lot of long tail distributions where it very much is a paradigm of the rich getting richer, right? Arjun, would you say that? Yeah. Yeah,
for sure, and especially for Google videos, and I'm familiar with what these channels are as well. So you see a fair degree of diversity. You'll see theconversation.com, which is an explanatory journalism outlet, which happens to be the highest ranked in this instance. You also find YouTube on Google Video, which I suppose would be expected. But you also find channels such as Entertainment Weekly, Women's History Magazine. So you've got a bit of diversity in that regard. The colors here mostly represent geography. So you'll see a lot of red, which in this case represents American-based publishers. Oh, there you go.
There you go. Sorry.
That's the list that I was looking for earlier. So you see a fair degree of diversity here. You see news publishers, you see entertainment and lifestyle channels, the Circle.ngo, which is an international feminist collective.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this represents the ranking of these sources. Yeah. This is another very useful device where we try to capture how this process takes place over time. I'd like to highlight what you see on the second graph there, where you see search results for feminism on YouTube. You'll see that there is remarkable consistency in the top few results. So essentially, that's TEDx Talks and Entertainment Weekly. So more often than not, at least in the period of our study, when people were looking for information on feminism on YouTube, they saw results from these sources. What were these results like? I've had a bit of a peek, and the results from TEDx did not inspire much confidence. I think one of the top ranking videos was titled "Why Feminism Needs Men." So that perhaps gives you a flavor for the sort of content that is prioritized.
To James. Oh. Yeah. Thank you, Arjun.
Yeah, so happy to take it from here. So just a few opening remarks. We had a massive long tail for Google News. So we ended up having to cut it down to 300 domains, and that was an iterative process. So what we're seeing are the most frequent 300 domains for 2 keyword sets I'll speak about in a second. I also want to set out a few kind of basic statements. The results were not personalised, so all of our citizen scientists were seeing a homogeneous or similar set of results, more or less. There wasn't some sort of crazy bias where, you know, someone who was Labor voting saw something that a Liberal voting person didn't see, which means what we're dealing with is a shared set of results for this grouping, and I think is also kind of a good sign for a healthy democracy. The other thing I'll say is, excuse me, the ranking, there was no structure in the ranking. So we're not doing a rank flow analysis. So when we're talking about frequency of observations, the domain could have been seen at rank 10 or rank 1. We're not making a call on what is the most, you know, most prioritised news domain. You know, we're saying this is just how often they're seen. Obviously, that in itself says something about how authoritatively Google sees this content. The final thing I'll say is there's already a rich amount of research happening in the United States, which says that Google is reasonably positive for diversity of news content. So we already know that to be a fact, or an emerging fact. What we're really interested in is, you know, what are we seeing really? And that's what are the domains we're seeing? And that's really the foundation of our question. So in that end, what we have is a tree map diagram above, which basically outlines different quartiles of domains. So to better kind of understand our results, we split them up into roughly 25% quarters. And that allowed us to see, well, what are the, you know, what's the top 25%? And pretty consistently, the top 25% of results for frequency of observation was 7 news sites. And that varied depending on the search term. But it showed a kind of strong propensity to prioritise certain domains for certain searches. We'll move on, because I think the keyword sets will provide. So we basically grouped into 2 keyword sets. What we see here is Australian politics, and this was done a year or 2 ago. So Scott Morrison is there, Albanese is there, UAP we took out because they don't really exist anymore. But what we see there, I think, is quite a robust keyword set where we can say this is probably more or less what people are searching for when they're looking for Australian politics. And we can say something, probably something quite convincing about the types of news domains that are frequently come to the surface when we search for this type of content. When we move on to global issues, there's obviously a lot of relevant stuff there. There's COVID, there's lockdown. If we were doing it today, we might have added something like Taylor Swift. Okay, she's a bit of a global issue these days.
She causes inflation.
She causes inflation, yeah. But I also want to note the presence of things like renewable energy and COP26. Obviously, global issues are very broad. That really, produced some interesting results. You know, we got a lot of sustainability domains, and I think, you know, while it's definitely an interesting set of results, I'm slightly less confident of this saying we can say something confident about global news more generally. So here are the top domains for Australian politics and global issues. This is in total the most frequently observed domains in Google News. And just to make the point that it's not Google News Showcase where payment deals happen, this is just the Google News search function. We see The Guardian, the ABC, we see the Daily Mail, we see news.com.au, we see a reasonable diversity of familiar news brands. In global issues, which we kind of hypothesised and suspected, there's a preponderance of United States domains there, particularly New York Times and CNN. The environmental and Renew Biz can be explained by our sustainability focus, hence the kind of asterisks on these results. But I think what's also interesting is the presence of The Guardian and ABC at the top there, and obviously the absence of any other Australian domain. So we can move on now. So another question we had was about localization. So if you search for a particular term, so remembering that Australian politics and global issues were keyword sets in total, if you looked for a particular keyword, did you get local or international results? So if you searched for Barnaby Joyce, for example, were they serving you a CNN story about Barnaby Joyce or an Australian story? We see here the red represents Australia, a strong return of Australian domains for an Australian politician. If we move ahead. Lockdown, which is interesting given, the kind of geographic, local and state-based variances during that period. We see a much more international kind of results. Obviously, you can raise really important queries that, people might have been searching things like Sydney lockdown or Melbourne lockdown, but it's still a kind of, I think, telling and at least interesting finding. Do we have more? That's it. Well, then I'll just say one more thing. I think the other thing to really note, in terms of, I think what's really key here is also just demystifying the search process, as we've kind of consistently been talking about. And our Australian politics search terms didn't always localise. So if you searched for the National Party, we got Australian news, but we also got a lot of New Zealand domains. Obviously the National Party of New Zealand. So I think that also just points to, and most people wouldn't be, I suspect, searching the National Party of Australia. So I think it also speaks to the limits of these algorithms and the limits of these kind of systems, and kind of, not denying their importance, but challenging the presumption that they're kind of all seeing and all knowing.
Perfect. Thank you, James. So look, I note some questions coming in over the Slido, which is great, so keep them coming. We have this slide here, challenges and opportunities. I'm going to take a pause on this just for a second before we go back to the panel for some of next steps and kind of what and kind of what next questions, just to answer some of the easier ones, because I do think they have a bearing on interpreting the results we've just shown. So I'll throw this to the panel, and some of these are smaller rather than larger. So the first question from Heather is, do you have any plans to release the data to other researchers? I can take that one. Yes. Also with the Australian Ad Observatory, these projects are very much kind of eventually going to make those results available to others. Of course, with anything like this where you're asking for citizens to donate data, there is a level to which we need to be very mindful about not revealing identities of individuals inadvertently. So if any of you have ever dealt with ABS data, you know how they kind of treat that and try and use processes to make sure people are de-identified. But certainly within this, we will look to make these data sets public because we think they have immense value to other researchers. If there's any other comments on that, no. On that then, there's also a question I have here around the general ethics of data handling and how is handling donated citizen data been different from API or scrape data. Again, with that, Abdul, I'll go to you first, and then I'll come and add my 2 cents. But
yeah, when we undertook this process, we went through a rigorous and really comprehensive process in order to understand anything that could go wrong and everything that we had to do to ensure that the research was ethical in every single way that we can, at least for the time being, define ethical. When you say that you're going to observe someone's search results, however, and you present it to a research participant, unfortunately, it's very easy to, with limited knowledge about the research project, perceive that the project won't be hounding in on your privacy, that it won't be taking more data than it should. There's this idea, and I think right now, there is this sort of, when you don't have the information, when you don't know about the general processes that go on, it's very easy to make the assumption then that the data that the process that we're undertaking is one that might compromise your personal identity. But we're very fortunate that in this project we've been able to think of all the different ways that the data could be handled, the ways that it should be handled, the ways that malicious actors could take advantage of it. And so we put up a variety of different security mechanisms to ensure that we're currently at industry standard of how we not only transfer data up to our cloud service, but also how we de-identify the participants. Your personal identification, your personal details, your own demographic characteristics are with respect to what can be identified, it's never ever sent up to our cloud server. We have a de-identified personal hash key of a sort that you can think of that identifies you, and beyond that hash key, nothing else can. And we are very mindful of this, and yeah, at least from a technical perspective, that's everything that we did to ensure that we're trying to be as ethical as possible in how we handle this data, and that we're meeting standards.
Yeah. So we didn't collect with this project, or indeed the Ad Observatory, things like email addresses, names, or anything like that's directly identifiable. The point on also, once you have enough information from someone, you can start to infer identity. So particularly things like geographic location, age, and other things start to become identifiable. We're very conscious of that, so we limit the degree to which and try and keep demographic details as vague as possible while still being useful in the research. But again, as Abdul's saying, making every effort to make sure before we go public with the data that we've done the work to maybe even add small amounts of like statistical jitter or other things, so that to prevent someone trying to reverse engineer an identity from this data. The other thing I will say with this is that the results themselves, right? So, the results that you get from these search processes can themselves be forms that could be used to identify you, right? So your search results, in the previous project, the Ad Observatory as well, your ads can be things that could potentially identify you in some way. So these are things that we're absolutely conscious of within the team. I'll come back to some more of these questions and keep them coming in, but maybe to some challenges and opportunities. So, next steps, obviously we're in a moment right now, I think, where the big question is around generative AI, and already there's been conversations in the centre around this moment of, well, we're not necessarily getting a huge amount of variation in search results. So if there's going to be variation, where might it come from? And I know there's been great work in the centre as well with Mark Sanderson and some others in looking at this. There's an article that's been published recently in the Communications of ACM that's a fantastic read that talks about how it actually may not be the engine so much as it is the way we search, right? And I know there's a couple of posters on this as well here at the symposium to go check out that explore these questions of so much of it's not necessarily the search term and the engine, it's how we actually construct the search term ourselves. But yeah, thinking about that and other challenges, what are some of your thoughts in terms of next steps from here?
Yeah, well, I can take that, Dan. I think in terms of news, speaking about some of those studies that I spoke about earlier, we're also seeing, and this is a slightly different method to what we're doing here, but it's just gesturing to other, I guess, methods that are out there, really quite detailed and, obviously, quite difficult to kind of develop, but really detailed web browsing studies where you get research participants to actually sign up and happily search away. And that's less about the search query itself and more about the domains they end up on. So in that respect, that at least helps us find out some information about where people end up through their searches, what sort of information are they seeking out at a kind of second-hand level, but it starts to answer some of those questions. And I think just to kind of jump off what Dan was saying as well, some of the really innovative methods, I really encourage everybody else to check out the posters at the PhD room, because it kind of points to that challenging next step, just to what you also said, Abdul, that you almost need to work with people and develop quite complex and even sometimes qualitative methods, dare I say it, to understand what people are doing and how they actually start to generate these questions. And I think, there's obviously been this focus on the algorithm for so long, and we're not sort of denying its importance, but, and it's classic triangulation, right? Like we're studying Google, we also need to go study everything else. I don't know if anybody else has.
Yeah, in terms of challenges, I think there are some challenges from a scholarship perspective because it's a very emergent methodology, data donations, and it's not very well established. So as a PhD student who would eventually want to publish my work, I'm a bit wary that that at least the way things are in communications research, there seems to be an established, there seems to be an acceptance for certain kinds of research, certain kinds of data from the Twitter API, for instance, RIP. But now that increasingly those conventional modes of data access become unfeasible, there perhaps would be more space for this kind of work, but I don't believe there is that acceptance for this kind of work as yet.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's one of these things where it's an emergent space, but one that we, I guess, through projects like this, it kind of takes, a big center to embark on this, to build this, because I mean, it does take years, right, to build this, to amass a cohort, to get 1,000 people on board, takes, the might of the ABC and others to get the word out there. So yeah, these are large, complicated infrastructures that we're talking about. I'm going to go to another couple of questions here because I think they are important as well. There's a couple of questions that talk more about the demographics, right? So Abdul, perhaps this is one for you, is how we've gone about showing statistical representativeness, right? Data donation, of course, by its nature is perhaps going to bias more towards progressive audiences or those that are kind of open to, say, the scientific method and such and are willing to sign up for this. So yeah, your views on how we've gone about I'll limit you to the kind of the crib version, not the full-blown data science version, if that's okay.
I think the
Sorry, I've totally put you off now.
I'm going to answer this with another question. Okay. No, look, we knew right away that we were not going to be perfectly representative of the Australian population. We wanted to deliver trends about the Australian population, but in order to be representative, truly representative of the Australian population, you would need the Australian population. So what we can do instead, where we can't represent the entire Australian population, we had a cohort of individuals that we did notice skewed towards certain demographic characteristics, but we're very fortunate that we are a large center. We do have many statisticians that we worked with rigorously in order to figure out ways to develop correlational analyses to identify who we were representing, who weren't we representing, ways then that we could fit our distributions to ensure that we weren't over-representing people too much, that we weren't undersampling or oversampling too much. And representation is simply one facet of the problem. There's also correcting for sampling error. Were the samples large enough or small enough? When we grab this data, how confident are we about this? How sure are we that when we have a result, that this result is actually a real result, that it's not simply the result of some simple random error that might appear within the data? So we've implemented a variety of different statistical methods to ensure that when we're trying to deliver results, that firstly we ask the question, well, is this question in relation to that we're trying to be representative? Are we trying to produce complete cohorts of information? Are we respectful of the fact that this data is also very ephemeral? You have large longitudinal studies like this done. The amount of data donated in one day is not the same as the next day, so you have to do corrections to ensure that the data is well scaled and normalized to be able to produce trends from day to day. But we're very fortunate that we've got the ability to have done that, and we did carry out really significant processes to ensure that we can be confident in the results that we're delivering.
Yeah, and so some of that has meant that we've asked for demographic details that then we can't actually utilize. So, because we haven't achieved the diversity, say, in that particular demographic question. And so that's a kind of a category that you unfortunately then need to pass over because you just simply don't have the statistical power. I'm going to go to a point that's related to this from Cesar about limitations for a project like this being monolingual, English language, Latin alphabet, given the multilingual composition of Australian society. And so were there any thoughts around that in terms of challenges that's presented or ways in which maybe, James, in the news aspect, like what you found there in terms of the news content in the long tail?
Yeah, well, I think, I think to kind of contextualise the results we've presented today, this was very much a kind of, to kind of contextualise in relation to the whole search experience. This is really our second wave of projects. So the English language component is really at least for me, the easy bit to tackle. It's also the, there's obviously things you're going to predict and hypothesise that come true that, US is going to be prominent. Maybe there'll be some UK or Canadian news. We can't really speak to broader terms than that because of the search terms we've kind of put in. But I think the benefit of this infrastructure and the benefit of the kind of broader algorithmic watch effort is that the capacity is there to do more with this. And, obviously that's also within the centre, but also beyond the centre. And I think speaking about what we've all done, a lot of what we've faced with is honestly just a lot of big data. And it's just taken a lot of people like Arjun, like Ari, to come along and just carve out a bit of that data and work on it. So there's definite opportunities to do more, both within the data set we've collected, but also looking ahead as we're building new research infrastructure, potentially, Dan.
Yep.
Looking ahead to that kind of diversity in the Australian experience.
Cool. I'm going to move to another question as well, unless you've got something to add on to that. No. That's from Patrick saying, can you confirm you didn't analyse the ranking of the items? Can you tell us why you took this decision? That's not true necessarily, and sorry if that's been communicated poorly.
I didn't.
You didn't, but there are other aspects. Maybe you want to elaborate a little bit on...
And I should say, it's not that I didn't, it's just that there wasn't a trend that we could find that was relevant for discussion. So we have a lot of rank flow diagrams that don't tell a story. So that story wasn't told today, but did you want to?
Yeah.
I think that is perhaps conditioned by the platform itself, but because in YouTube, it is of a lot of value to us because we see a lot of consistency in the top ranked results where certain publishers feature prominently across time. So, and it is central to my research question as well. So that's something that I am considering.
Yeah, again, it speaks, I think, to the complicated and multifaceted nature of the data we have, because of, ranking is one dimension. Of course, you have time, you have, all the other considerations on, the keyword selection you want to look at. All these things add dimensions of complexity in how you start to analyze the results. At a certain point, it becomes this big murky soup, right? To kind of where you're averaging on averages of averages, and at a point where everything just bleeds into one. So that's where I think the approach here, when you're dealing with such a massive data set like this, is kind of threading the needle in terms of picking out one particular key issue or one of those particular platforms or one particular moment within that year-long data set that we've amassed to try and understand that. And I think in also thinking around the ways in which we start to make this public, it's also important that we don't make it public too early without doing illustrative analyses of how you can analyze and interpret this data. I think there is a danger that I would see in making some of this data public early, in that people start to misinterpret results or paint pictures that aren't there. And so I think there's a duty of care almost in us being so intimately involved in the collection of the data, doing some of that first pass analysis to show, okay, these are the limitations and these are the ways in which you can confidently analyze, correct for sampling bias, do that necessary work, and then say, right, over to you, here's the keyword set, you might be interested in this particular set of Australian politicians or COVID or whatever it might be, go to town and see what you can do there. I'll have a look at any other questions coming in. There's a question here, it's a bit more kind of legal of nature. I've seen it hanging around there from Kate Bauer saying, given the data showing YouTube is an outlier, do you have an opinion on the recent Google versus Gonzalez Supreme Court decision? I don't know if you, Arjun, or James want to take that one on. I think ask the legal profs in the room, right, for their perspective on that particular case around terrorism and kind of the role of kind of platforms as broadcasters versus content providers. How much of the rankings are the outcome of SEO? Did Guardian.com just pay the most money to their SEO agencies to rank for these keywords? This is a good question. I'm going to throw maybe to Abdul to explain, because there's another question here around what we captured, and Abdul, perhaps you want to go to, it's not just the ranking, right? Yeah.
Yep. So there's a lot to unpack here. So there is the ranking of the content, and you might have a result that appears at the very, very top of the results, but that result only appears once or twice. Frequency of observation is something that is also really important here. You know, it's not enough to simply say that, oh, this search result is averagely ranked at the very, very top. It only appeared for 10 seconds and then it disappeared and we never ever saw it ever again. Whereas you might have results that are frequently appearing but are always appearing at the bottom of the search results, and that's something that is a real phenomenon, and that, you know, it shows that they have a dominant place, as James alluded to and as Arjun alluded to. You have domains that, you know, exist, and they simply have been able to wedge their part of the search result page. But we also grab things like advertisements as part of the research. We grab you know, things that might have been paid for to insert into the actual search experience itself. We acknowledge that you know, these search engines are quite contemporary and innovative, and that they've invented new ways in which data is positioned on the page, that it's served to you. And I think that really this is, these search engines have, in their own respects, become really, really powerful in the way that they present data to us, but then we're only really scraping the surface here. Citizen science, you know, data donation method is something where, in this particular project, we've identified a variety of keywords, and we've come to realize that personalization is something that wasn't as prominent as we thought it would be. But now we're coming to new questions like, well, you know, we've identified a series of keywords that we've analyzed, but then how much of the actual individual's own queries influence the results that are shown, and how can advertisers, or what say, you know, prominent domains that want to present themselves, anticipate these queries and then be able to actually serve themselves up in the search results. So it's really quite multifaceted, and it's something that cannot be studied from simply one statistic. You would have to take a whole range of different methods, and I think that's a multimodal analysis that would then produce the answer to that question. But I don't think we have a clear indicator yet. And I think anyone who does have a clear indicator about the best SEO for any of these search engines has the key to the internet and the ability to pervade anywhere. But
you can go find them on YouTube, right? I'm sure there'll be plenty advertising themselves there. We are very much out of time, but I just want to give one final thought on that, what Abdul was talking about. I mean, for me, one of the most surprising things of this project is actually how little search ranking result is present in these pages, right? Like, you know, some of these terms we looked for, COVID, things like that, you'll be amazed at just how much these products, these platforms have changed over time. And when you actually really critically look at that front page, that search results are kind of somewhere down the bottom, and instead what you're getting is this kind of curated view of information. And I think in this current moment, that's something for us to consider in the next phase, right? Is what's generative AI going to do to that in terms of, you know, providing us summaries, you know, doing other things to curate our kind of online information seeking experience. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you again to our panel for joining us today.